Improving your Chinese after you reach an advanced level requires new ways of learning and new sources of motivation. If I could go back in time to give a less proficient version of myself advice, here is what I would say. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to pretend that I have a time machine so I can go back in time and give myself advice. This is the third and final installment in this series of episodes with the time machine, and in the previous two episodes I went back to myself as a beginner and then as an intermediate student, and so today it's time for myself as an advanced student. Reaching an advanced level of Chinese is an achievement in itself, of course, comparable to completing a university degree in terms of invested time and energy. Yet the journey doesn't stop just because you can understand spoken Chinese in a wide variety of contexts and make yourself understood effectively. Are you able to use Chinese in a professional context? Can you explain complex topics you know well so that others can understand them too? And can you learn new skills and acquire new knowledge entirely through Chinese, without the language getting in the way? In this episode, we are going to talk about learning Chinese as an advanced learner, how to keep learning and keep improving even though you might already have reached most of the goals you set for yourself when you started learning. In the previous Time Machine episode, I talked about the intermediate plateau, and if you think that one was daunting, I can tell you that the advanced slopes beyond the plateau go on forever. To continue learning and improving and approaching a near native level of Chinese, you need to find not just new ways of learning, but also new sources of motivation to keep going. So, since a time machine is involved here, what am I going back to exactly? Well, I started learning Chinese in 2007, and I think I reached an advanced level after 4 or 5 years when I enrolled in a master's program for teaching Chinese as a second language taught in Chinese with mostly native classmates. I don't have a strict definition for what you count as advanced here, and many of the things that I will talk about today should also be relevant for intermediate learners as well. Naturally, I'm still learning Chinese, and so I count myself as an advanced learner, but if I thought I qualified as an advanced learner a decade ago, it follows that I think I must have learned something over these 10 years that I think would be worth sharing with a younger and less proficient me. If you're listening to this as a beginner or even an intermediate learner, you might think that when I say that the more I learn, the more I realize how little I know is a cliché, but it's still true. Knowledge really is like a bubble. The bigger it becomes, the larger the surface area towards the unknown becomes. And learning Chinese really is a lifelong journey. In this episode then, I will share some of the things that I've picked up or noticed over the past 10 years that I think that other advanced learners would benefit from. If you are a fellow advanced learner, I would appreciate it very much if you headed over to the written article on Hacking Chinese to share your best advice to fellow learners. We are, after all, rather different, and I've based this off what I think I should have done differently, and of course also what I see other students should do differently. But hearing from more students would be helpful, so please leave a comment if you've reached an advanced level yourself. As with the previous episodes in this series, you don't need to be familiar with how I learned Mandarin in order to make sense of the advice I have to offer, but if you're interested in hearing about my story, I'll put a link to the first article in a series about that in the description of this episode, and there you can find all the articles and all the podcast episodes telling that story. And also, as I've pointed out in this series before, what I mean with beginner, intermediate, and advanced roughly corresponds to the levels A, B, and C in the Central European Framework of Reference for Languages. So advanced being on the C1 and C2 levels then mean that you can deal with most types of Chinese, not necessarily specific topics related to professional things or academic topics and so on, but you're able to deal with language as you encounter it in everyday life, and you can also express yourself rather freely and mostly accurately in writing and speaking. I have tried to summarize the advice I'm going to offer in this episode under one heading, and that is keep the momentum. So let's explore what that means and some concrete ways you can do that. Let's start with a simple statement that will sound very obvious. Most students don't reach an advanced level because they stop learning. Well, duh, of course, if you stop learning, you won't reach an advanced level, but this is actually rather profound because it also implies that most people who don't reach an advanced level don't do so because they try a lot and then fail. It's because they stop trying. Another way of putting this is to say that each step is very easy, it's just that there are so many steps to take, and that is what makes improving difficult. This means that motivation and keeping the momentum really is what it's all about, because if you can maintain those, you will improve over time. Here are 2 questions you should ask yourself. So first is, why do you want to keep learning? It's likely that you have already achieved most of the goals that you set out when you started learning Chinese, and if you want to keep on making progress, you need to have another goal in mind or find something else that drives you forward. The second question is, how are you learning Chinese? At lower levels, basically anything you do in Chinese is quite difficult and challenging, so just keeping doing those things will mean that you improve. But once you can deal with these things comfortably as an advanced learner, you really need to look for opportunities to learn in a different way. Once you have created a zone in Chinese where you feel rather comfortable, staying within this zone means that you won't learn as much as if you had ventured outside it. The problem is, of course, that leaving a comfort zone is by definition uncomfortable. But that is what you need to do if you want to keep improving. Another question I want to address before we get to the advice itself, and this might sound almost heretical to some, is if it's worth improving your Chinese. When should you stop? Maybe you should learn another language or get a PhD instead of becoming slightly more advanced in Chinese. I think this question requires some serious thought because at an advanced level, the law of diminishing returns really starts to kick in. If I had taken, say, 80% of the time I spent on Chinese after I reached an advanced level and invested that time somewhere else, I might have been able to learn German, Spanish, and Italian to a decent level, or I could maybe have completed a PhD in one of the many areas I've considered over the years. Or I could have built something more than a one person in their spare time type of business out of Hacking Chinese, or any other major endeavor that you care to mention. I'm still here though, and apparently so are you. So these sober, rational calculations of what makes sense to do and what is worthwhile aren't always what determines what we do in life. It's also a bit unfair to compare something like getting a PhD or building a business to learning Chinese, because the latter can be mixed and integrated with everything else you do, and the former cannot. If you make sure that most of the media you consume is in Chinese, and you also have a situation where you use the language, you will learn. But you can't draft a research proposal while jogging, and learning accounting isn't very relaxing compared to watching something interesting in Chinese. Or at least I don't think so. I love learning and teaching Chinese, and so that's what I'm doing. But if you feel that you have reached your goals already and you don't have any strong motivation to keep pushing, then don't. That's fine. There are other things in life besides Chinese. Be happy that you have achieved your goals and find some way to maintain your level while focusing on other things. Heresy, I know, but it needed to be said. Now that that's out of the way, let's look at advanced Chinese advice number 1. Find genuinely interesting content and enjoy yourself. This is something I stressed quite a lot in the intermediate time machine episode as well, because it is essential that you use your hobbies and interests to power your reading and listening so you can do those enough if you even want to get to an advanced level in the first place. As an advanced learner, however, this becomes even more important because you will never be able to spend thousands and thousands of hours listening and reading if you don't enjoy it. Or at least you won't be able to do so year in and year out, which is what you should do. Your mind will keep wandering and you will end up engaging with content you enjoy more in other languages. People sometimes ask me how I learned English, considering that I've spent no more than a few weeks in English-speaking countries in my entire life, and the answer is vast amounts of extensive reading and listening. I have read or listened to well over 1,000 books in English, and more than that again in the form of articles, websites, videos, films, TV shows, podcasts, and so on. I haven't been immersed nowhere near that amount of Chinese yet, but then again, my Mandarin is not as good as my English either. Interestingly enough, a few years ago, I did a rough calculation of how much I had spoken the 2 languages in my life, and concluded that I had spoken at least twice as much Chinese as English. This is of course because I've spent 4 years living in a Chinese-speaking environment, and a sizable portion of my social life for the past decade or so has been in Chinese as well. Obviously, you don't need to read 1,000 books and listen to 20,000 hours of Chinese audio to reach an advanced level, but it is a good target if you want to reach near native proficiency. Don't take the exact numbers I've provided here too seriously though, let it suffice to say that they are very high. Now, you might be asking yourself why I'm telling you this, and it's not to scare you. I'm bringing it up because you need to find ways that you can engage with Chinese a lot and over a long period of time. And that will only happen if you genuinely enjoy it and if you're interested in what you're reading and listening to. The reason I've been able to immerse myself in English so much at home is because I've been truly motivated to do so. Not because it would be good for my English, but because I've been genuinely interested in the content. For example, I like staying up to date with world affairs, so I have listened to every edition of The Economist since 2008, and that's 4,500 hours of audio just from that single source. And what about the 1,000 books I mentioned? Well, I certainly didn't read them or listen to them for language learning purposes, except maybe for a few dozen that I read in school. This is what I'm trying to replicate for learning Chinese as an advanced learner now, and it is what I think that other advanced learners should try to emulate if they want to reach a near native level. The bottom line here is that you need to find interesting content. An effective way to verify if something really is genuinely interesting is to ask yourself if you would have found this content interesting in your native language. And if the answer is yes, then you're good, but if the answer is no, you need to keep looking. Finding interesting content is often hard, and if you're anything like me, you need to actively go looking for it. It won't just appear magically. But of course, depending on your preferences, maybe you find this is rather easy, and then you are luckier than I am. Just to be more concrete, I'll share 2 examples of things that I genuinely enjoy in Chinese and that I've been able to use successfully to listen and read to at least a few hundred hours of Chinese. The first is learning science and technology with Li Longle Lao Shi, which I talked about in episode 30 of the podcast, so check that out if you are interested. As I'm recording this, he has almost 600 videos on his YouTube channel, and I think I watched almost all of them. I think he's a great teacher, and I enjoy listening to him, partly because I'm interested in how he presents things and how he explains tricky topics, but also because I'm interested in the topics themselves. The topics themselves are not related to my profession at all, it just happens to be something I enjoy doing and that I would do in my native language or in English for that matter. The second example is something I used to do a lot but don't do much anymore, and that is to watch professional matches of StarCraft, and that's a computer game if you're not familiar with it, where commentary is in Chinese. If this doesn't mean much to you, it's a little bit like watching football or cycling or some other sport on TV with Chinese commentary. If you really care about these activities or you want to see who wins and hear the analyses and so on, you can do this in Chinese, and this will provide you with infinite amounts of content. Naturally, I could have done both these things in English, but of course I want to improve my Chinese, so I try to find these opportunities where I really genuinely enjoy using Chinese to learn about something or to enjoy something. Let's move on to advice number 2, which is vary your input and pop the filter bubble. Unlike the advice I've offered in the previous installments in this series, the advice I'm offering here are more like a 3-stage rocket in that you cannot have stage 3 and 2 without stage 1. So the first advice about finding genuinely interesting content and using that to power your reading and listening is the most important thing. If you don't do that, these other things don't matter much. But under the provision that you're already doing that, let's have a look at what it means to vary your input and popping your filter bubble. So the term filter bubble was coined by Pariser more than a decade ago, and he didn't use it to describe stagnating language learning, but rather a state of intellectual isolation resulting from limited variety of input made worse by social media and content algorithms that try to please us. I do think that the filter bubble is applicable to learning Chinese as well. While it's great that I've watched hundreds of videos with Li Longle Lao Shi, this alone is not enough. It's just the first stage of the rocket. He is, after all, only one person speaking in a certain way about a limited range of topics and in a similar style. If you only have a handful of such sources of your Chinese, your input will be too limited. This, of course, is not to say that you shouldn't spend 1,000 hours reading your favorite wuxia author or listen to everything produced by that stand-up comedian you love, but it means that this is not the only thing you should do. As you might have noticed, there is a superficial contradiction between advice number 1 and advice number 2, because first I said you should really follow your interest and do what you like. And here I'm saying beyond that, you also need to do things you don't normally do, and those usually are the things you don't like as much. But if you're serious about improving your Chinese, you need more diversity. Here, I believe TV, radio, newspapers, and other forms of curated content can play a key role, because while it's great to choose your own content all the time, having fixed programming means that you will be exposed to Chinese you normally don't listen to and don't read. If you listen to a wide variety of radio programs and watch a range of TV shows, etc., you will be exposed to diverse kinds of Chinese in several different ways, such as topic and subject matter, vocabulary and idiomatic expressions, formality and tone, including slang, sentence structure and syntax, pronunciation and accent, cultural references, context, purpose and target audience, register and domain-specific language. The same is true if you read articles in a magazine or a newspaper or any other form of media where someone else has curated the content for you. Again, this is stage 2 of the rocket, so don't let this principle override the first one. It's still more important that you do what you like so that you do it, but if you're already doing that, try to also diversify. Let's move on to advanced Chinese advice number 3, the third stage of the rocket. Challenge yourself and leave your comfort zone. I promised earlier we would get back to comfort zones, so that's what we're going to talk about here. And if you think about it, what I just said for advice number 2 about listening to more diverse forms of content, that is already a form of leaving your comfort zone, because of course it is rather nice and comfortable to listen to things you are familiar with, or reading more text of the same kind that you're already used to and know that you like. So now we're not going to talk so much about reading and listening, because we already did that, but instead focus on speaking and writing, where you should also try to leave your comfort zone. This time I'm going to zoom in on something very specific and then zoom out again to get the general picture. So let's start with pronunciation. That's very concrete and very specific. The reason that most students don't achieve clear and easy to understand pronunciation in Mandarin is not because the sounds and tones are impossible to learn or that the students are stupid, it's that they reach a level they are comfortable with and don't find it worthwhile or don't want to invest the time and energy required to go beyond this. To be clear, I'm not saying that this is inherently wrong, just as it is not wrong to say that your Chinese is good enough and that you want to learn some Spanish instead. But if you aren't happy with your current level, you need to leave your comfort zone and put yourself into situations where your current proficiency isn't enough. For pronunciation specifically, this often happens when you talk about more complex topics in Chinese, because as we all know, if you talk about something where the listener can guess what you're going to say regardless of how you say it, making a tone error or having some other oddity in your pronunciation doesn't really matter that much. But if you're explaining something complicated or want to convey something that the listener doesn't feel is obvious, then making mistakes can be very detrimental to communication. It's often the case that even a single tone error, for example, can throw the whole sentence off so the native speaker doesn't understand what you want to say, even if the rest of the sentence was perfect. This happens to me occasionally, and I've also heard from many other advanced learners that this happens to them as well, and it is as if the listener's tolerance for errors in the output has gone down as the proficiency goes up. This is not really what's going on, of course, it's more an effect of you talking about more difficult things, and if you're doing that, making mistakes can actually influence communication rather often. Before we move on to speaking in general and then writing, I'd like to shamelessly promote my pronunciation course, which is not just for those who want a good grasp of Mandarin pronunciation, but also for you advanced students who aren't sure how good your pronunciation is and what issues you should focus on and how. For more about this, check out hackingchinese.com/courses. So what I just said about pronunciation is true for speaking in general as well. When you talk about everyday events and topics, using the correct vocabulary and syntax isn't really necessary because your conversation partner will be able to figure these things out, and if not, they will be sorted out anyway in the natural flow of the conversation. This is especially true if you're talking with a partner or a friend who knows you well and where the conversation environment is friendly. If you want to keep learning Chinese beyond this, though, you need to challenge yourself and leave your comfort zone. For example, if you use Chinese in contexts you are not used to, you learn to adapt to these new situations and thereby keep learning. This is, of course, one of the major advantages with using Chinese in your job, because then what you say, what you write and read and listen to is dictated by what is required of you, not just what you like doing, which is usually the case if you're learning on your own. Personally, I learned the most as an advanced learner when I was enrolled in the master's program I mentioned earlier, because then I had to deal with a whole range of new topics and new situations and needed to learn to deal with these in Chinese. Similarly, when I teach courses in professional development for Chinese teachers, these courses are taught entirely in Chinese, and so I need to be able to talk about the topics that we cover in a language that not only makes sense and that people can understand, but that is also sometimes rather precise and is supposed to be easy to understand, not just understandable. So I thereby challenge myself to speak more precisely and to teach more effectively. If you don't have access to this type of practice, you can also simulate this with having a one-on-one teacher, provided of course that this teacher doesn't just become your friend and lowers the bar because they know you well. You need to find someone who doesn't let their guard down and can push you to improve. This leads us to another form of challenge, namely that of talking with people you don't know. When you speak with your spouse or maybe those few Chinese friends you have, they will be very tolerant of the way you speak and will be able to understand you even when you make tons of mistakes. The same is of course true for most teachers who are very good at understanding students even if they are not speaking very well. Strangers are usually less forgiving, not because they are not nice people, but because they don't know you. They don't know the way you speak, the words you use, your accent and so on, and so they can't be as tolerant and still understand what you're saying. Speaking Chinese in a manner that everybody finds easy to understand is, of course, much harder than speaking in a way that the people who already know you understand what you say. We could go even further in this direction and say that the most demanding type of situation is when you are in a neutral or even hostile situation. This is not something that I've experienced much myself, but it's easy to imagine this in a professional context. For example, if you have a customer who is angry at something, or you need to negotiate something at work, or you need to figure out why a project didn't go according to plan, or why someone hasn't done what they were supposed to do. In these types of situations, the people you speak with might not have your best interest in mind, and that increases the demands on your Chinese because you can no longer count on the listener being benevolent and being tolerant of mistakes and errors and so on. Now, I don't mean that you should deliberately start fights with people in order to practice your Mandarin, but there are many situations where you might use the language in contexts where people might not like you by default. So to summarize, leave your comfort zone. But also remember that this is stage 3 of the rocket, so don't do this so much that it influences stages 1 and 2. You should still do all the things that you like and do most of those things. I'm just saying that if you're already doing these things, leaving your comfort zone and challenging yourself can be very rewarding in terms of progress with your Chinese. Before we round off this episode, I'd like to say a few words about writing as well, because everything I just said is of course true for writing too. I think writing is the tip of the reading iceberg, so you should definitely read a lot if you're not already doing that, and then you can also practice writing on top of that. Just like before, just writing so that other people understand what you say is probably something you can already do as an advanced student, even sometimes about fairly complex things, so you need to put yourself in situations where this is no longer enough. Examples of this might include writing a thesis in Chinese, or at work, maybe you need to write something where simply conveying information is not enough. You need to also convince people or make something very clear. In these situations, precision or being persuasive or other things beyond just conveying meaning become important. I've written a lot about improving writing ability already on Hacking Chinese, and you can also check out episode 28. So here I will not go through all these things. I will just add one thing that I think is extra important for advanced learners. And that is to make sure that when you get feedback, make sure you get feedback from someone who can actually write well. It's easy to think that native speakers are automatically better writers than you are, but I think that this conflates two different things, and that is a bit dangerous. Yes, of course, it's true that their usage of vocabulary and grammar and so on is probably much better than yours, but it's certainly not true that all native speakers are better than you at structuring a text, presenting arguments, and describing complex things in a simple way. It can help to think about the analogous situation of a foreigner learning your native language. If you think of all the family and friends you have, and then evaluate them on how good they would be at giving feedback to this advanced learner of your language, do you think that all these people you're thinking of would be equally good at giving feedback on writing? Well, of course not. Some of the people you know will be very good at giving feedback, but I'm sure you can think of at least one person who would be outright unsuitable. This is, of course, true in Chinese as well, but the problem is that when you are the foreigner learning the language, it can be rather hard to figure out who is a good writer and who isn't. I don't have any quick and easy advice for how to fix this problem, but I think that getting feedback from more than one person, sometimes you can do that with the same piece of text, for example, can be helpful, and then gradually you will figure out whom to trust. So the time has come to wind down the time machine for the last time and summarize this episode. To do that, I'd like to propose 3 roads that can lead to Chinese mastery. None of these are guaranteed to get you to your goal, of course, because just like a normal road, you also need to walk in order to get anywhere, but I feel rather confident that you need at least one of these to succeed. So the first one is to have your social life in Chinese, and depending on what your social life looks like, this can cover either none or all of the stages we've described above. Naturally, if your social life consists of one person, you will not get the variety we talked about above, and depending on the personality of the people you hang out with, maybe they won't make you leave your comfort zone all that often either. Still, this can be very enjoyable and genuinely interesting, and therefore it's also a key to lots of listening and speaking. The second road is cultivating a genuine interest, and this is essentially what advice number 1 was all about, finding the content that you find genuinely interesting and that you want to learn more about. Not to learn Chinese as such, but just because you like it, and this will, of course, enable you to listen and read more. The third road is to use Chinese in your job, and this neatly captures both advice 2 and 3, because if you use Chinese in your job, you need to diversify and you will leave your comfort zone. I've written more about these 3 roads in an article on Hacking Chinese, and I'll put a link to that in the description. If you're an advanced student and you have listened this far, it would be interesting to hear what you would tell yourself if you had a time machine, or of course what you would just tell other advanced learners who want to improve their Mandarin. We are all different, we learn in different situations, so your advice might benefit someone else. So please head over to Hacking Chinese and leave a comment. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.